Almost every company in this history dies the same way. A conglomerate circles a struggling family firm, buys it cheap, strips out the valuable pieces, and sells off or shutters whatever is left, usually within a decade of the takeover. It is such a common pattern in the machine tool trade that it starts to feel less like a business story and more like a law of nature, the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape. The Ingersoll Milling Machine Company did not die that way. For more than a century, one family refused every offer, resisted every merger, and kept building some of the largest, most sophisticated machine tools on Earth entirely on its own terms, answering to no board of outside directors and no distant parent corporation sitting somewhere in another state, deciding which of its divisions were worth keeping. That independence was, by any reasonable measure, the company's greatest strength. It built the biggest milling machine in the world not once, but twice. Invented the transfer line that mass-produced automobile engines for half a century, and put its machines inside aerospace programs and hydroelectric dams on multiple continents. And then, in April of 2003, that same fierce, generations-deep insistence on staying independent helped kill it. Nobody bought Ingersoll and tore it apart piece by piece the way 100 other companies in this history went down. It simply ran out of money entirely on its own. 3 years after the last member of the founding family to run it had died still writing to his employees that the culture that built the company would carry it successfully into the next century. This is the story of a machine tool empire that refused for 4 generations to be acquired, and ultimately paid for that refusal in the most complete way a company can. The company's roots trace to 1885, when a Cleveland, Ohio machinist named W.R. Ainen started a small operation building milling machines, die sinkers, and feed grinders with a half-dozen employees. One more modest shop among dozens crowding a city that was rapidly becoming one of the country's great centers of metalworking. A local judge named Jonathan Ingersoll invested in the business on behalf of his son, Winthrop, a young mechanical engineer educated at Western Reserve University and briefly at Oberlin College, who had already developed a particular fascination with high-production milling equipment, rather than the more general-purpose machine tools most shops of the era built. When Anon died in March 1888 at the age of 51, Winthrop Ingersoll, still in his early 20s, took control of the operation. The partnership briefly carried the name Anon and Ingersoll before Ingersoll bought out his remaining partner in March 1890 and renamed the firm the Ingersoll Milling Machine Company, a young man's name now attached to a business he intended to build in a genuinely different direction from the general-purpose shop surrounding it. The following year, the company was granted its first patent for a device called the porcupine cutter, a rotary milling tool built with a large number of small, individually replaceable cutting teeth, arranged around a cylindrical body, rather than relying on one continuous cutting edge the way most milling cutters of the era did. The design mattered because it distributed the cutting load across dozens of small teeth, engaging the workpiece simultaneously, rather than concentrating it on a single blade, which meant the tool could remove metal far faster than a conventional cutter of the same size. Produced a smoother, more evenly distributed finish because the load never rested entirely on one point of contact, and, critically for a shop's operating costs, let a customer replace individual worn teeth on the spot rather than discard or completely regrind an entire expensive cutting head every time part of it dulled. It was an idea Ingersoll would keep refining and building an entire cutting tool business around for the next century. And variations of the porcupine cutter concept, many small, replaceable inserts distributed around a rotating body, remain in use in modern high-speed milling tools today. In 1891, Winthrop Ingersoll made the decision that would define the company for the rest of its existence. He relocated the entire operation from Cleveland to Rockford, Illinois, one of the fast-growing new industrial centers of the American Midwest, a city that would go on to build much of its a 20th century identity around precision manufacturing in exactly the way Ingersoll itself was about to demonstrate. The first Rockford plant employed just 19 people and cost $12,000 to establish. A modest beginning for a company that would eventually claim, more than once, to have built the largest machine of its kind anywhere on Earth. It did not stay small for long. By 1902, Ingersoll had built what was, by most contemporary accounts, the largest milling machine in the world at that time. A 200-ton mill, roughly 400,000 pounds of iron and steel, constructed for the Alice Chalmers Company. A machine so far beyond the scale of anything most of its competitors were attempting that it functioned as much as an advertisement for the young firm's ambitions as it did a working piece of production equipment. It was an audacious statement for a firm barely a decade removed from a 19-employee startup, and it announced, in the bluntest possible terms, that Ingersoll intended to specialize in machines other builders simply could not or would not attempt, a strategic decision to compete on raw scale and capability rather than on price or volume, the way many smaller shops of the era did. By 1917, with the country deep into wartime production for the First World War, the company employed 600 people and had become closely tied to contracts from General Electric and other major industrial customers who needed exactly the kind of oversized, purpose-built machining capacity Ingersoll had spent its first quarter-century learning to build. The 1920s brought the company's first year of $1 million in sales, continued plant expansion, and, more significantly, one of the genuinely foundational inventions in 20th century manufacturing. Ingersoll, built with the company credits as the first transfer line ever constructed for the automatic machining of automobile engine blocks. A transfer line, as the concept would go on to be used across the entire automotive industry for the rest of the century, links a series of individual machining stations together with an automated transport system so that a raw engine block casting moves automatically from station to station, each one performing a single fixed operation, boring a cylinder, drilling a bolt hole, facing a surface, without a human hand repositioning it between stops, emerging from the far end of the line as a fully machined block in a fraction of the time and labor a shop full of general-purpose machines would have required. Other builders, ex-Cello among them, would go on to build enormous businesses, supplying exactly this kind of equipment to Detroit in the decades that followed, filling real, documented production lines at companies like Chrysler, with their own competing versions of the idea. But Ingersoll's own corporate history places the very first working example of the concept at its own Rockford shop in the 1920s, years before the post-war boom that made transfer lines a standard fixture of nearly every American engine plant in the country. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, it slowed the company, but did not break it the way it broke so many of its smaller competitors. And when prosperity began returning in the years that followed, Ingersoll expanded its Rockford footprint by purchasing and converting a former piano factory, the old Schumann piano plant, into additional manufacturing space, a small but telling detail of just how opportunistically the company scooped up capacity whenever cheap real estate became available. Repurposing a building built for a completely different kind of precision craftsmanship into one more wing of a growing machine tool empire. The post-war decades were, in almost every respect, Ingersoll's golden age. A stretch of nearly 30 years in which the company seemed able to do almost nothing wrong. In 1953, the company topped its own 1902 record, by building the largest milling machine in the world for its own use inside its Rockford plant. A machine built not to sell, but simply to expand what Ingersoll itself was capable of manufacturing for everyone else. By the late 1950s, several more machines of comparable scale had been added to the Rockford floor, and outside observers considered the facility one of the most modern and productive machine shops anywhere in the world, a genuine point of civic pride in a city that had built its identity around precision manufacturing. The company's customer base expanded aggressively into new territory well beyond its original milling machine roots. Aluminum production, where Ingersoll built massive scalping machines used to skim the outer surface off cast aluminum ingots before further processing. A business that grew rapidly as aluminum use skyrocketed across the post-war consumer and aerospace economy. And diesel locomotive manufacturing, supplying the large-scale machining equipment that built engine components for America's railroads as they converted away from steam power. The 1960s opened with contracts to build 2 enormous transfer lines for an Opel automobile plant in West Germany, an early and significant sign of the company's growing international reach at a time when most of its American competitors were still selling almost exclusively into the domestic market. And in 1966, Ingersoll built what it describes as the world's first transfer line incorporating computer numerically controlled machines, marrying the raw high-volume efficiency of the old mechanically sequenced transfer line with the programmable flexibility of the new CNC technology that was just beginning to reshape the machine tool trade elsewhere in this history, where a purely mechanical transfer line, driven by cam drums and fixed tooling, could only ever produce one part design without an enormously costly physical rebuild of the entire line. Folding CNC-controlled stations into that same sequence meant at least part of the process could be reprogrammed for a design change without tearing the whole line apart, station by station. A genuine leap in flexibility for exactly the kind of enormous, capital-intensive equipment that automakers otherwise expected to run completely unchanged for a decade or more once installed. By 1970, annual sales had reached $37 million, placing Ingersoll 15th among American metal-cutting tool manufacturers, despite the company's continued preference for staying privately held rather than raising capital on public markets, the way many of its larger rivals had, and the company's acquisition of the German firms H.A. Waldrich of Siegen and Waldrich Coburg that same year, cemented its position as a genuinely international builder of large machine tools and complete manufacturing systems, rather than simply a large American regional shop with occasional export orders. Behind all of that growth sat one family, generation after generation, in a way that had become genuinely unusual among the machine tool builders in this history by the second half of the 20th century, most of which had long since passed into the hands of professional managers, holding companies, or public shareholders with no personal connection to the founder at all. Winthrop Ingersoll ran the company as founder and president for decades after 1891, building it from a 19-employee startup into an internationally recognized name, without ever seriously entertaining an outside buyer. Leadership eventually passed to his son-in-law, Robert Gaylord, who had married into the family and carried the business through the middle decades of the 20th century, and then in turn to Robert's son, Edson Ingersoll Gaylord, who joined the firm in 1947 as a third-generation executive. Edson's own path to the family business ran through Phillips Exeter Academy and Princeton University, where he was a member of the Tiger Inn Eating Club and earned a degree in English literature, rather than engineering, an unusual academic background for a man who would go on to run one of the world's most technically sophisticated machine tool companies for the rest of his working life. Before he ever set foot on the Rockford shop floor, he served as a captain of field artillery in the 131st Battalion of the 36th Division, seeing combat in Germany during the final push of the Second World War, an experience that put him inside the very country whose machine tool industry Ingersoll would spend the following decades competing against and eventually acquiring pieces of. He married Jane Wanzer in 1954, and the couple had 5 children extending the family's presence at the company into a fourth generation, waiting in the wings. Under his direction, ownership of Ingersoll remained almost entirely inside the Gaylord family, a structure that had, by then, persisted, essentially unbroken, for well over a century. At one point, Edson and his brother, Clayton Gaylord, established a family trust, specifically structured to keep it that way, one whose terms prevented beneficiaries from selling or transferring their individual shares until the year 2021, a deliberate, generations-long mechanism built to guarantee the company would stay independent long after the men who wrote the trust themselves were gone. A bet on the family's own continuity that assumed the business itself would still be standing to inherit. That same independence, the thing that had let Ingersoll build the biggest milling machine in the world twice and invent an entire category of automotive manufacturing equipment without ever answering to an outside board, left the company with almost nowhere to turn when its finances finally soured in earnest at the turn of the millennium. The broader machine tool industry had been through a punishing stretch through the 1980s and 1990s, squeezed by the same wave of Japanese and, increasingly, other Asian competition that had already devastated dozens of other companies in this history. And Ingersoll, for all its engineering prestige, was not immune to that pressure simply because it built bigger and more complex machines than most of its rivals. Through 2000, 2001, and 2002, Ingersoll sold off pieces of itself in a series of increasingly urgent moves that, taken together, read like a company trying to buy time rather than plan a genuine recovery. The profitable Ingersoll Cutting Tools division, one of the company's oldest and most reliably earning businesses, went to the Israel-based tooling producer Iscar Limited in 2000. A controlling interest in the German cemented carbide toolmaker W.R. Hart Metal was sold to the tool grinder producer Walter AG in 2001. And in 2002, the company cut loose its money-losing Naxos Union crankshaft grinding machine business in Germany entirely, letting it fall into receivership, where it was later picked up by a competitor called EMAG. By the company's own account, revenue stood at $358 million in 2001, against a $17 million loss, with debt reduced to roughly $50 million, and a return to profitability reported the following year in a corporate statement meant to reassure customers, employees, and lenders alike that the worst was over. On paper, that reads like a company successfully cutting its way back to health, trimming underperforming pieces and stabilizing around its strongest remaining businesses. According to an account later posted by a former longtime Ingersoll employee, the deeper problem sat somewhere else entirely. Edson Gaylord had, for years, resisted broader efforts to sell off other underperforming product lines or divisions to raise capital more aggressively, preferring instead to keep pouring the company's shrinking reserves into next-generation machine tool technology, high-velocity machines built around linear motors and hydrostatic spindles, technology that was not yet fully market-ready and had not yet found the paying customers needed to justify its continued development. At a moment when the banks that had already extended Ingersoll as much credit as they were willing to back in the 1980s had no further appetite to lend against a family-controlled company with no outside equity partner to share the risk. Edson Gaylord died on April 3rd, 2000, after a battle with liver cancer, having written to his employees in his final days that he believed the policies and culture that had guided the company through the previous century would see it successfully through the next one, a message of confidence delivered from a man who, by that point, had led the company through more than 50 years of its history and had no reason left to doubt it. He was, by his own hometown newspaper's description, one of the last of the old line captains of Rockford industry, and the last member of his family in direct line at the city's largest private industrial employer, a title that would not survive him by more than 3 years. 3 years later, on April 4th, 2003, Ingersoll International filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection. The corporate headquarters in the Rockford plant, along with a sister facility in Midland, Michigan, closed permanently within days of the filing. A shutdown so abrupt that longtime employees later described walking out of buildings they assumed would still be standing the following week. The workforce that had once numbered more than 2,200 people at its peak had already been cut to fewer than 400 through 3 separate rounds of layoffs in the preceding 4 years, and there was no fourth round left to make. There was simply no company left to employ them. A turnaround firm called Morris Anderson and Associates was brought in to manage the wind down. The same crisis management outfit that had steered the Goldman Industrial Group through its own bankruptcy the previous year. The collapse that had already ended Bridgeport, Bryant, and Fellows within the same history. A small, grim coincidence that meant one consulting firm in the early 2000s had a hand in closing out several of the most historically significant names in American machine tool manufacturing within the space of just a few years. Unlike those firms, though, Ingersoll had not been swallowed by a roll-up conglomerate loaded with acquisition debt from buying up a portfolio of unrelated distressed companies. It had simply spent itself out on its own, defending its independence right up until the moment there was nothing left to be independent with. A genuinely different mechanism of failure from almost everything else in this history, even though the final outcome, empty buildings and a workforce out of a job, looked much the same from the outside. Not everything went down with the American parent. Ingersoll's wholly owned German subsidiary, Ingersoll Maschinen und Werkzeug, comprising the Waldrich Siegen, Waldrich Coburg, and Ingersoll Funkenerosion-Technik operations, and tracing its own lineage back to a Waldrich firm, founded in 1840, decades before William Sellers even opened his own first Philadelphia shop, employed 1,200 workers, and was explicitly excluded from the bankruptcy filing, remaining profitable throughout the entire American collapse, and continuing to operate without interruption. It was sold later in 2003 to the German machine toolmaker Maschinenfabrik Hercules for a transaction valued at roughly $79 million, including assumed liabilities, the last major asset liquidated out of the bankrupt American estate, closing out a sale process that had taken several months of careful, court-supervised negotiation to complete under Section 363 of the United States Bankruptcy Code. The Ingersoll cutting tools business, already sold off to ISCAR back in 2000, eventually passed into the IMC Group, and in 2013, that entire group was purchased by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, meaning a piece of the company the Gaylord family had spent a century refusing to sell to any outside conglomerate ended up, a generation later, folded quietly into one of the largest and most famously acquisitive conglomerates on the planet, run by a man whose entire investment philosophy was built around buying exactly the kind of durable, well-run family businesses the Gaylords had spent their whole existence trying to keep out of anyone else's hands. The core American milling machine business itself was eventually reorganized after the bankruptcy and acquired by the Italian Camozzi Group, continuing today as Ingersoll Machine Tools, still headquartered in Rockford, still building enormous, sophisticated machines for aerospace, defense, and energy customers, including hardware supply to NASA and wing mold tooling used in Mitsubishi's work on the Boeing 787. And in 2019, the company set a Guinness World Record for building the largest three-dimensional printer ever constructed, a machine called Masterprint installed at the University of Maine. Proof that the underlying engineering talent that had built the company's reputation across more than a century had survived the bankruptcy, even where the family ownership structure that had originally assembled it had not. There is a genuine irony sitting at the center of this story that is worth sitting with for a moment. The Gaylord family spent more than 100 years and at least one explicit legal trust making absolutely certain that Ingersoll would never be absorbed into a conglomerate, the way so many of its competitors in this history eventually were. And for most of that century, the strategy worked exactly as intended. The company grew, innovated, and built some of the most remarkable machines of its era, entirely on its own terms, free of the quarterly earnings pressure and portfolio trimming instincts that hollowed out so many of its rivals. In the end, independence did not save it from collapse. It only guaranteed that when the collapse finally came, there was no outside owner left to absorb the blow, no larger balance sheet to lean on, no acquirer standing by to negotiate a soft landing or a partial rescue. Just one family running out of its own money, defending a principle that had served the company exceptionally well for 112 years and failed it completely in the 113th. Every other machine tool company in this history that avoided a slow conglomerate death instead met a fast one of its own making, and Ingersoll's version of that fast ending came dressed as loyalty rather than recklessness, a family's refusal to let go rather than a stranger's decision to strip and sell. And in the years since the bankruptcy closed its books, pieces of the company now sit inside precisely the kind of enormous, distant, diversified industrial holding structures the family spent its entire existence trying to avoid. An Italian machine tool group running the Rockford plant that once bore the family name, and Warren Buffett's own famously acquisitive conglomerate holding what remains of the cutting tool business. Proof that in the end, staying independent bought Ingersoll considerably more time than most of its peers managed. 4 generations instead of 2 or 3, but not a permanent escape from the outcome nearly all of them, sooner or later, eventually shared.